This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider Video Interview. The subject is the television show Barney Miller, a sitcom from the 1970s. I argue that it's a great television program, and I have three people who will back me up, I think. The sitcom Barney Miller from ABC television in the 1970s is the subject of this discussion. I have three people who will talk about it, but before we do, I'd like to give each of my guests a little bit of introduction by way of themselves. So let me start up on the top with Mike White. Mike, if you could give a little bit of background about who you are, what you do, and your interest in Barney Miller.
Sure, yeah. I'm Mike White. My primary not day gig is being the host of the Projection Booth podcast, but I also host a podcast called The Life and Times of Captain Barney Miller, which I think will be a little bit more apropos of this conversation. You can find that at barneymillerpodcast.com, and we are going through every month and looking at, I think, 3 episodes of the series. I'm only up to about the 4th season, though, so anything past that, you guys are going to lose me, because I've seen the whole thing, but in the original run, I think. So don't tell me about Nick dying. I don't want to hear anything about it.
So, Mike, did you watch the show in its original run then? Were you a long-time fan, or did you discover it later on?
Oh no, I'm old. So I've seen it back when it was originally playing. I specifically remember seeing it, I think, in its original air, plus then of course in reruns during the summer. I think I even watched a little bit of Fish, but I don't recall if I saw that much.
Lance Strait, let me ask the same of you. If you could get a little bit of background about who you are and your opening volleys about Barney Miller.
Sure thing. I'm a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University, and I study a number and write about a number of different things, including media and technology, communication and philosophy, media ecology and general semantics, including a book called Media Ecology: An Approach to Understanding the Human Condition. A lot of my work is based on folks like Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman, who are very interested in television, and some of the work I do is also based on analysis of popular culture, including things like science fiction, but also television and television history. So that's where I come to Barney Miller. I too am old, and so I watched it in its original run back in those days. If you missed an episode, you missed an episode. So you didn't have the chance to watch all of it, but I do remember seeing some of it on reruns. And like Mike, I missed Fish, but I know that I saw episodes with him. I don't know if it was a summer rerun or maybe it was later in syndication. But I did get to be interviewed about the program for the International Business Times, which was a lot of fun. And that was, I don't know, back about 5-6 years ago.
I have to ask you, Lance, your background, the rest of us seem to be in dens or rooms. Is that one of those fake backgrounds? Or it looks like Jason or Michael Myers is going to come through and stab you.
Yes, it's a virtual background, but it's a close-up of an old-style TV screen. Or, for perhaps younger viewers may not realize this, but black and white was never black and white. It was black and blue, and when you look closely, you saw 525 lines alternating back and forth to create that motion. And for many of us, even though color television was introduced in the 60s, we still watched a lot of television on little black and white sets, which is the way that I watched a good amount of Barney Miller.
And my final guest is Otto Bruno in the bottom corner. Otto, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself and your opening thoughts about Barney Miller.
Well, these days I'm a freelance writer and radio host. I've hosted a radio show for about 22 years here on a local public station, but that's all music of the 30s and 40s, the Great American Songbook. And I've been a freelance writer for about 25 years now. And I just a couple weeks ago, the book came out. It's called Barney Miller and the Files of the Old One Too, and it is my first full book. And when Mike said, "Oh, I'm old," well, I knew that out of the three of us, I don't know how old you are, Dan, but I knew out of the three of us, he had to be the youngest because I saw Lance's resume, and he has done so much that I just assumed he was older than Mike was, and I know I'm older than Mike is. So I did start watching Barney Miller when it first came on. In fact, at the very beginning of the book, I talk about I have an actual memory of sitting down and watching the very first episode with my dad. My father was someone who, you read all these stories and see all these movies where they talk about how sons could only connect to their father through sports. Well, my father could not possibly have cared less about sports. He was not interested in sports. But we were able to connect through TV and the movies. We'd go to the movies together and we would sit down and watch television together. And this was one of those shows that we watched together from the very beginning. So I did watch it all the way through its initial run. I watched it whenever I could see it in syndication and reruns. In fact, I was always a little annoyed that it didn't seem to play on reruns as much as some of the other shows did. I mean, you couldn't turn around without, God forbid, seeing Gilligan's Island 18 times a day. But it was hard to see Barney Miller on, in syndication. But as soon as the first DVDs, they started releasing them one season at a time, and I started buying them, and then they stopped after season 3. And that ticked me off. And then finally Shout Factory put out the whole 8 seasons on DVD, and I had that order in before it even came out. I was waiting for that. So I truly think it is one of the very best sitcoms of all time. I really think it's one of the best sitcoms of the 70s, and there were some really good sitcoms in the 1970s, the ones that are always talked about and always remembered, in particular, seem to be All in the Family and MASH. And while I would never deny the importance of both of those shows, I thought both of those shows eventually lost their way and veered off into dramedy. And while Barney Miller always tackled tough issues as well, they always put the focus first on being funny. And that's what I appreciate about it.
Yeah, Barney Miller is one of I put in the top 10 sitcoms. I did an essay some years back. I'm 57, by the way, so I don't know if that makes me, where that puts me.
I got you by 1 year.
Okay. So I did, the reason sometimes you get things bubbling up. I'd mentioned before we went on the air, I'm going to be doing a show about Mickey Spillane, and it just popped into my mind a few days ago for some reason. But one of the reasons I wanted to do this show is I was thinking about a woman I dated whose name was Denise Miller, and that was the name of an actress who was on the Fish show, although it's not the same woman.
Oh, okay.
But so I was thinking, let me do, because I've done a few shows. I'm trying to do great television shows, and I'm starting with sitcoms. And then also about 2 years ago, I interviewed the actor Paul Lieber, who played for a season on Barney Miller.
And I interviewed Paul as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But I don't know which one of you guys want to start, but let's talk about the premise of the show, because up to that point, as far as I know, well, I guess there was the Fred Gwynn television show.
Oh, Car 54, where are you?
But this was really, in a sense, I mean, that was a decade before Barney Miller or so. But this was an unusual premise for a sitcom. So how did that actually get started? Whichever one of you guys wants to take that.
Well, from what I could find out through my research, you will see on the front of every Barney Miller show, it says created by Danny Arnold and Ted Flicker, or Theodore J. Flicker. Flicker is probably best known today for a 1967 motion picture called The President's Analyst, which is actually a pretty good film. and was so controversial at the time because it poked fun at the FBI and the CIA and things like that, that supposedly J. Edgar Hoover had it pulled out of theaters. But what happened was these two guys, and Hal Linden told me one story, Danny Arnold's sons told me another story. They weren't quite sure whether it was their agents or whether it was the network, but apparently both Flicker and Arnold had an idea for a situation comedy about policemen. And whether it was the agents or the network who said, well, we're not going to buy both of them. If you guys both have similar ideas, why don't you get together and come up with a premise and do something with it, and we'll look at that. So that's how it happened that they did this original pilot. And that pilot was turned down by the network, by ABC, and ended up being shown on a summer show called Just for Laughs, where Hal Linden, I think, used the line that Just for Laughs had more dead pilots than the Japanese Air Force in World War II or something. You know, some kind of line that you couldn't say today, but I just did. So what happened is it gets turned down, it gets dumped on this Friday night show, and then somehow Danny Arnold went and bought out the deficit financiers of the show, so just the money people, because apparently the money people had 50%, Danny had 25%, and Flicker had 25% or something like that, or 33 and 33 and 33. So Arnold went and literally mortgaged his home and bought out the deficit financiers so he could get control of the show. And then he went to ABC and convinced them to give the show another chance. And they said, okay, we'll give you 2 episodes. You can do 2 more episodes with an option on 13, meaning a mid-season replacement. So if we like the next 2 episodes better, we'll give you a mid-season slot. And apparently, Danny Arnold called up Flicker and said, we don't need you anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Don't come in. You're done. And obviously that didn't sit well with Mr. Flicker. However, according to the Writers Guild of America guidelines and rules, because the next 2 shows were still basically the same premise, he had to get creator credit. So everybody I spoke with, Hal Linden, Max Gale, the Arnold brothers, the writer, Tony Sheehan, writer, producer, and all these guys, they all said they never met and never saw Ted Flicker in their lives. So he never was on the set again after that first initial pilot, which, as Mike knows very well, was called The Life and Times of Barney Miller, and then it was just shortened to Barney Miller.
Right. That brings, because for many years in the back of my mind, I said to myself, when I first saw Barney Miller, there was a show with Hal Linden with that same title, but more words. And it was on basically this summer, what would have been the summer of '74, I guess?
It was shown in August of '74 on this program called Just for Laughs.
Yeah. I've gone on a lot of TV websites, for shows people can't remember the name of or what. And I said, I could have sworn there was a show. It was only 1 episode, I guess, with Hal Linden playing a Barney Miller character, and then when he came back, it was somehow different. So did that pilot feature Barbara Barry, his wife, more?
No, it featured Mike. Who was the woman that did the?
Oh gosh, I don't remember who the wife was.
She played Joey Bishop's wife on his sitcom. A beautiful actress, and I can't think of her name now. I feel bad because she was a good comedian.
Yeah.
And of course, the whole premise of The Life and Times of Barney Miller was that it was supposed to show his life at the station house and his life at home and how they interacted and, the tension it caused and all that. And what happened is when they showed that, even the first pilot, everybody, the reviewers, the network people, in a rare case of the network people actually getting something right, nobody liked the stuff at home because it was just the same old domestic comedy stuff. But the stuff at the station was gold. It was great. And so they very, very quickly veered off and went straight to all the stuff, you know, a workplace comedy basically. And as you say, the woman who was eventually hired to play his wife, Barbara Barry, ends up fading from the scene because there was nothing for her to do, and she got kind of fed up, and she didn't, you know, she didn't want to hang around for 4 or 5 shots a season to come in and bring his lunch, you know.
Right.
So since we have the basic premise, then let me start with you, Mike, and let's talk about Hal Linden, since he's basically the main character. But it's very rare when you think of a titular sitcom, either if it's the real name of the actor or the character that the actor is playing, that the character, in a sense, isn't the star, because Hal Linden, you know, I mean, he might have had the most lines in any particular show, but he was the straight man.
Oh yeah, which was fantastic. I love that he is that straight man, and he's the one that keeps them all together.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of episodes where he just disappears into his office for a long time, but when he comes out with authority. And I mean, he gets to see the lunacy. I mean, the lunacy not just of New York City at the time, but also the lunacy of his own men and the people that he's brought in. It's such an interesting premise that we don't leave the station house very much at all. It almost all takes place just on that one set. It is so rare when we leave. I mean, to Otto's point from earlier, seeing his house was something that you would see kind of often in the first few episodes, but then that got dropped and you were just in that station house.
Yeah.
And yeah, his presence was, you described it perfectly, him being the straight man. He was just there to be the one to react, and he could give reaction shots like nobody's business.
Yeah. And it was basically a 23-24 minute playlet, you know, every week. Let me ask you, Lance, given the multi-ethnic cast of the time, yes, there were the Lear shows, there was Sanford and Son, Chico and the Man, but this was, I think, the first show where the ethnic differences were not the main cause for there being ethnic characters on. So what, and this is directed to you first, Lance, what was the impact of a show like this just being thrust into the culture? Because you had an Asian in Jack Sue, you had a black fella, you had an ethnic white guy in Wojo Howitz, then you had Gregory Sierra as the Hispanic, and I was Fish supposed to be Jewish? I'm not
Yes.
sure. But Barney Miller was Jewish.
Fish and Barney were both Jewish.
So, Lance, if you could speak on that aspect of the show.
Sure, but first let me just note that when Otto brought up All in the Family and MASH, there's a third sitcom that goes with them, which was the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which can be overlooked because it doesn't have the same obvious emphasis on social issues and social relevance, but the initial premise of that was that she was going to be divorced, and then they kind of dropped that because it was a little earlier than the other two and they weren't willing to go out on that limb. But it did introduce, or maybe not introduce, but certainly solidified the idea of the workplace comedy, which Barney Miller then picks up on. So I think that's particularly important. I mean, also the issue of divorce, although Barney Miller didn't go there. It was One Day at a Time in 1975 that made that safe for television. Prior to that, even though most of America, the divorce rates were skyrocketing, all the single parent sitcoms, they were always widows and widowers, and because divorce still had the stigma. But Barney Miller did deal with him being separated at a certain point. They just didn't go all the way on that. But in one sense, it's very New York. That New York is very ethnic and multiracial. And I don't know where you guys are from, but I'm from New York, and it definitely had that New York feel. And to the point about Barney and Abe, being Fish being Jewish, that kind of played against type. Typically, I mean, the old stereotype was of the Irish cop, and then add to that the Italian cop. But there was a tradition in TV sitcoms for a long time where either Jews or Italians represented ethnicity. That was symbolized just the general concept of being ethnic as opposed to being just basically white. I mean, they did spread out from there. I mean, Wojo was Polish, and they actually played on the fact that Polish jokes were very popular during the 60s, and there was this ethnic stereotype of Polish individuals being dumb.
Well, Meathead on Meathead, on All in the Family.
Yeah.
Right.
Except that went against type. Remember that,
he was smart.
in other, that he actually was an intellectual, and that was in keeping with the All in the Family's idea of going against prejudice. Barney Miller sort of like played with that in different ways. I'm blanking out on the name. Harris.
Ron Glass.
Yeah, I mean, that flew in the face of typical depictions of African Americans of this time as being kind of from the ghetto and speaking, in this very, kind of dialect, Black English kind of way, the dynamite. I've been seeing that guy on commercials with JJ or whatever. He's old now doing TV commercials, but it almost anticipates sort of the Cosby Show in that respect. The fact of it, having a Japanese American was simply unusual, and for that period. And although if you jump ahead a little bit, when we get to the 80s, there is a big influx of Japanese businessmen, particularly coming into the area. Because of the economic shifts that were going on. But I mean, the overall effect was of the melting pot, if you like, which is, again, it's pure New York, where it's not that their ethnic identities were lost, but rather they were very clear in most cases, except for the Jewish part. That was like very subdued. It was rarely brought up, which is also in keeping with a lot of the media industries where they were always very reluctant, probably because so many people running them were Jewish, that they felt reluctant to play up Jewishness too much. With some exceptions, there was a sitcom, Bridget Loves Bernie, that was about a Jewish Catholic, interreligious, marriage. But usually that was sort of like kept kind of subtle. But that overall feel, and there's a sense in which there was a lot of going against typecasting or going against stereotypes in a lot of the depictions, which goes along with the more liberal and countercultural view of that time. The very fact that it's in Greenwich Village, which is kind of the center of the counterculture, the place where people are cool. That was where cool was defined on the East Coast, as opposed to Haight-Ashbury on the, in San Francisco on the West Coast. So of course the cops there are cool, and which again just goes completely against the stereotype of police. During the 60s and early 70s, the police were the bad guys. They'd say, the saying pigs off campus. But in some ways that almost kind of suggests the movement towards a more conservative outlook, which was embodied when Jimmy Carter became president. Although he's thought of as being extremely progressive today, in that moment, 1976, it was the start of the turn towards a more conservative politics that then just swung wildly when Reagan became president.
Well, it should be said, Barney Miller and what was Fish's first name? Phil Fish. You know,
You know.
it's not like it was Fischel and Guildenstern. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
Rhoda on Mary Tyler Moore was Rhoda Morgenstern, so she was the morning
Yes.
star. You know, she
Right.
was the. Let me go back to you, Mike, and let's just go briefly through the main characters. We talked about Max Gale as Wojo Howitz, and other than Fish, who got his own show, Wojo was probably the biggest laugh getter there.
Oh yeah.
Talk a little bit about Gale and his character.
Well, not only was so much of it was playing on the last name for so long. That was just the joke. You know, it's spelled just like it sounds. But I really felt that he was the heart of the show. I mean, Barney is kind of the brain of the show, and Wojo for me was the heart. And so much of the show is him learning acceptance. You know, you're talking, Lance, about this being in the village, and Wojo was not the most accepting guy. You know, the one episode I remember the most when I was growing up was him arresting somebody for having the American flag on his jeans, I think it was.
On the
And
butt.
right. And Wojo's this ex-Marine, kind of a lunkhead, kind of just not the most progressive guy, really homophobic. But as the show progresses, I think Wojo progresses. And I think really so much of the show is us learning through Wojo. I think he's not the Archie Bunker of the precinct, but he's the guy who's just a little bit out of it, and everybody else is a little bit hipper than he is. And I'm glad that he is there to kind of show us like that you can change and that you can progress. And he goes through a lot of changes. He's got love affairs that go on, several of memory serves. He the one of the few things that comes back quite a few times in the first few seasons is him going for that exam, and he finally makes it. And so we get to again see the progression of this character. And this was in a time when you didn't carry through very often from one week to the next. This is not TV of today where you have a whole season arc. You know, this is very much these capsule episodes, and I really appreciate that they actually do speak back to previous episodes and that they will have ongoing storylines. I think right now in season 4, it's the whole thing about Harris trying to get an apartment and he and Dietrich eventually living together for a while, and how he cannot stand Dietrich because they're, to your point again, Lance, he's an intellectual as well as Dietrich, though Dietrich will not let you forget that he's an intellectual. So
Wojo's also younger. I think that's
yes.
also, part of it. And he represents, and that's the room for growth. I think that's a great point that you're making, Mike, the heart of the show, and the fact that he's not just a dumb person and that's it, but, that he has that heart and that and openness for growth is very important.
Yeah.
Otto, let's talk about Ron Glass. He went against stereotypes in the sense that he was real spiffy and a dresser, but they didn't go to the pimp stereotype. And there is a sense of him being prissy and fey, and he later played Felix Unger on the black version reboot, The New Odd Couple, a few years after Barney Miller went off.
Right.
Talk to me about his performance and his character.
Well, it's interesting just quickly to touch on something Lance had said earlier about this whole melting pot in this station house. Believe it or not, when I was reading some of the old reviews, a lot of critics didn't like that. Like they kind of demeaned that, saying that they were being too obvious about it, which is interesting to look at it now, that they were actually complaining about the fact. Some, to be fair, also said, well, it makes sense because they are reflecting that melting pot of New York. But some actually thought it was overdone and heavy-handed, which I think is very funny to think about now.
Well, they're also not on the beat cops; they're detectives. So that's
exactly. Harris, and I don't remember if it was. I think it was Lance who said this too. And I make this point in the book that if you pay attention in the first few episodes in that first season, Harris does talk with more of a ghetto slang to his verbiage, basically. and as he, you know, as time goes on, he becomes more and more the writer and the intellectual. And I was told by Danny's sons and by actually by a number of people, but they all said that every one of those detectives represented a piece of Danny Arnold's personality. So Jack Sue was the gambler. Well, Danny was a gambler. He owned horses. He owned race horses. There would be times where they couldn't find Danny because he was at the track. Okay. And then Harris was the guy who liked all the best things in life. He didn't care about whether he had the money or not. That was Danny. Bill Persky, who was one of the writers on the Dick Van Dyke Show, he was good friends with Danny, and he told me, "Oh, Danny always spent above his means. It didn't matter whether he had it, but he spent it." And Wojo, I think, was also that kind of, you know, he starts off as that character who sees everything in black and white, and certainly through Barney's tutelage, he has to eventually look at the fact, like Mike said, that, you know, he's got to open up and be a little more tolerant and realize that the world around him is not as quite as simple as he thought. The Harris, I love the fact that Harris, like Mike was saying, I think it was Mike saying, talking about Harris and Dietrich. That was a hilarious combination, the two of them. Just great, because Harris was very bright and very smart, but you could almost, like, before Dietrich comes into the squad room, you could argue that aside from Barney, Harris was the most intellectual guy in the room. And then all of a sudden, Dietrich comes in, and you see that kind of brought out some insecurity in Harris. Like you're saying, it's just, they could have easily been very stereotypical characters, and they were not. Danny made them human and well-rounded. In fact, the only guy who, in a way, left because he felt his character was too stereotypical was Gregory Sierra with Chano, because Danny Arnold, and you'll see it later on when he brings in June Gable to play Batista, and you'll even see it in a late series episode with a superintendent who's Hispanic. Danny thought it was very, very funny when Chano would get angry and start talking in Spanish. He thought that was great fun. And the first time he hired June Gable to do it, he said, well, then when you get there, just get upset and start swearing in say something in Spanish. And she said to Danny, okay, she says, you're going to have to get me a coach, or you're going to have to write it out for me phonetically. And he said, aren't you Hispanic? Aren't you Puerto Rican? And she says, no, I'm Eastern European. But he had seen her on Broadway in the play The Ritz, and she had played a Hispanic character, so he assumed she was Hispanic. So, and Sierra kind of left because he didn't want to get stuck in that very stereotypical role of the fiery, passionate Hispanic, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, didn't he also leave Sanford and Son to go on to Barney Miller?
From what I was told, I think he got like a holding deal from ABC, and they promised him his own series. And apparently, I can't remember if this was Max or Hal who told me this, but they felt that he had been told by ABC, we don't have anything for you yet. Go into this show and we'll develop something for you. Yeah. So then after 2 years, he kind of said, I don't want to do this anymore. And he left. Eventually, he did get his own show, created and produced by Danny Arnold, called AES Hudson Street. Oh, and sadly, it only lasted like 6 episodes. I actually thought it was kind of funny. It was basically Barney Miller in an emergency room, essentially.
Yeah, and it should be stated that the Ron Glass character was also the artist of the bunch. He Blood on the Bad, his memoir come Mickey Spillane kind of attempt.
Right. And just quickly, you mentioned something about how unusual it was for a Japanese character. The reality is, of all those people that were in that show, Jack Sue was an old friend of Danny Arnold because they had both been nightclub comics in the late 40s and early 50s and had met on the road, like in the Midwest in various clubs. And Jack Sue, of course, his real name was Goro Suzuki. And he had changed his name to a Chinese name because he had been put in an internment camp during World War II. And so when he came out, he had to have a Chinese name because, you know, believe it or not, kids, back then, we were allies with China. And he wants to change his name. He's all excited in the late 50s because he gets a role in a musical called Flower Drum Song. And he's all excited because he figures, now I can go back to my real name and become Goro Suzuki. And the producer said, no, it's supposed to be based in a Chinese nightclub. We already have 2 Korean women in it. We need you to keep your Chinese name. So when he goes on Barney, it was very important to him that his character was Japanese.
Go ahead, Lance.
Yeah. Now, I would just point to that you know, in this period of time, there's still lots of folks, you know, kind of in their middle-aged folks who were around during World War II. And I mean, I remember from adults when I was growing up, you know, there were people who would never, ever buy anything made in Japan. Yeah. You know, that they carried that grudge of Pearl Harbor to their dying day. And the same thing about never buying anything made in Germany, which, you know, created a certain amount of friction when we got to the point where Japanese and German cars were kind of so popular.
Well, Lance, let me talk to you then about a couple of the older characters. The Phil Fish character played by Abe Vigoda, and I guess he rode the fame of the Godfather to get that role. And then also James Gregory, who was a really great character actor for the prior 30 years. And he plays he's not in every episode, but he plays the cranky, crotchety old guard who's constantly remembering the good old days. So if you, Lance, we could talk about both of those older characters.
Well, you know, I guess that's Luger.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, Luger is very much the foil for Barney Miller. And, you know, there's the tension. It's not as much on display as it is in All in the Family, but the tension between, you know, kind of the older generation and Barney Miller, although he's not that young, and still represents, you know, as does his, you know, everyone but Fish, pretty much, and well, you know, represents a kind of younger approach to things and the more tolerant kind of view that's emerging out of the 60s. So that's very much on people's minds. You know, we talked about the generation gap that existed at that point, which is much wider. I mean, today, you know, you might say, oh, there are digital natives and digital immigrants, and, you know, and that kind of thing. You know, oh, those millennials or Generation Z or whatever. But that big gap doesn't exist the way it did. I mean, we do talk about the culture wars less in terms of age today as between the red states and the blue states, but in a lot of ways, Luger in particular, more so than Fish, but, you know, represents those culture wars, and gives Barney Miller something to kind of stand up to, I think, in a lot of ways.
Lance, you know, I grew up in New York with a lot of corrupt police departments and whatnot, and to me, Luger's character is, in a sense, the most realistic cop. I mean, there's plenty of episodes where he said, "Come on, Barney, just take him out back and give him no business." Or, you know, he said, you know, someone, you know, he'd see the 2 gay guys that we'll talk about in a little bit in the jail. What are you, couple of degenerates? You know, or some comment like that. So I mean, in a sense, he is that. I mean, I don't know. I guess Luger would be a German name, but he is that Irish kind of cop mentality.
Well, yeah. I mean, it sounds a lot like Trump if you think about it. You know, speaking of German names, because that's, you know, it was changed from the German, but But yeah, I mean, that was something, that was a kind of undercurrent and a tension that existed throughout the culture, but was there. I mean, you're right that I mean, Archie Bunker and All in the Family, although he was portrayed as a typical WASP, really represented an Irish Catholic kind of identity, in terms of New Yorkers. And again, specifically to an older generation. But I think, again, Luger has that. I think Fish has less of that. And again, that relates to his ethnicity, and the same thing with Frank Sue's character. The more ethnic they are, the less they're going to be kind of in your face about being, kind of conservative and talking about that. But I mean, you're right. That was the real police force. I mean, to some extent, it remains, just nationally, that the problematic aspect of police culture. But I think that's also a stereotype, and there was an attempt to counter that stereotype. But also, New York police and the NYPD, while they weren't the most progressive group in New York, and certainly had to be more progressive and more open than folks in other parts of the country. I mean, back when Ed Koch was mayor, they practically de facto legalized marijuana in New York so that people were not being arrested, and the police were part of that. So again, I think he still represents a kind of old guard that was on its way out and is being depicted as being kind of like old and in the way, if you like, and that's where, like, reminiscing about the old days is a sign that you're no longer, which is, I guess, what we're doing here, is a sign that you're no longer like in the now, you're no longer current.
And was Vagoda really the breakout? Mike, you can take this. Was Vagoda really the breakout star? Is that why he got his show?
Yeah, definitely. I was going to, real quick on Lance's point, the thing about Luger is that he was always kind of toothless. He never really had, he was a figure for fun. And he would come in and say ridiculous things and get Wojciechowicz's name wrong. And eventually, he eventually makes it to the opening credits and shows up occasionally, but he's mostly there just to be the dumb guy. It was interesting to me that Scanlon is the only one who really is a threat to the precinct, and he's the internal affairs guy, and he's always trying to get Barney. But Luger was always, at first I found him to be very annoying, but then he kind of becomes much more endearing as he comes in, and you're just waiting for Luger to come in, misunderstand the situation, come up with a couple quips, talk about how that waitress over at the diner, she, had it coming to her kind of thing, and then off he goes. But yeah, I really appreciated Luger as the years went on, and and then Scanlon was just always such a SOB that you just hated whenever he showed up.
Well, George Murdoch did a great job. George Murdoch as Scanlon was the equivalent of the guy on MASH, Flag.
Yes. Colonel Flag, yeah.
So, Mike, I did want to get back, though, to Jack Sue for a moment, because speaking of stereotype, he's the opposite of the Asian stereotype. He's slovenly. He's not the brightest. He gambles. He doesn't seem to have any kind of real life outside policing and gambling, and yet he's also very funny. And I did, before I did this show on Barney Miller, the previous show I profiled was the Bob Newhart show, and there's a famous scene, the Boo Goo Gaipan scene in Bob Newhart, where they're and then there's the famous hash brownies scene. Is that probably still the favorite episode on Barney Miller?
Yeah, I think that has to be the best. I have not laughed so hard at anything in so long. Oh my God.
And doesn't Nick go like mushy Bond?
Mushy. Has anybody seen my legs? They're about this long. His deadpan delivery, oh my God. Just, you're waiting for Nick to come in with the quip because it's going to be good. And there's that episode where he was cooking something authentically Japanese. And he starts talking about the ingredients. Well, you got fish heads and
Cucumber peels.
right, just oh, it tastes like garbage, and then eventually, oh, it is garbage. Oh man, so good. I love his character. He is just, he brings such a freshness to it. Every single time he says something, it is great. And he gets away with a lot of great digs on characters just because he is so deadpan.
Yeah. Now, a couple of other characters that came on and became regulars later. I want to talk about them. The first one is Ron Carey as Levitt, and he's the Napoleon complected guy who's trying to make it as a detective, and he's really the only on the beat cop that we really see. Although I guess maybe does he run the mailroom, or what is he?
Well, at the beginning, we saw Officer Kogan,
Right.
who was played by a guy named Milt Kogan. So they just named the character after the actor. And he was on, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 episodes, something like that. And then you have Levitt introduced in the that bottle episode where they're there because they think that they might have smallpox, and that's what introduced to Levitt. I believe that's the opening show of season 3. And
right, because he had just played a villain in season 2,
exactly.
the mole. Yeah.
The mole, Angelo the Mole Molinari. And Levitt, like Steve Landisberg, they both played criminals that had been brought into the station house first, and then after Levitt, once Levitt starts coming up and down, sometimes he's filling in for people who aren't there. Then they eventually introduce Officer Zitelli. Yeah. And Zitelli is basically doing what Levitt used to do. He delivers the reports, he delivers the mail.
Was Zitelli the gay character?
Yes, he was the gay character. And, I said in the book, some people liked the character of Marty and Daryl and thought it was progressive for the time. Others thought it wasn't very progressive. It was kind of just a typical, stereotypical, although there weren't a lot of just stereotypical gay characters in 1975. But Zitelli comes off as, a capable police officer, and he lets Barney know he's gay, but he doesn't want, internal affairs. He doesn't want Scanlon to get a hold of it because he knows what'll happen. Yeah. But Levitt, I don't think Mike and his partner Chris have quite crossed over yet to like.
Not yet. We're getting close though. The last couple episodes, he's been a little bit more bearable.
But Levitt is another thing. Earlier on, Dan, you mentioned Car 54.
Yeah.
And I said the only 2 predecessors that I pointed out in the book to Barney Miller were Car 54 and, in a sense, the Andy Griffith Show.
Mm-hmm.
And although Andy Griffith was smart, he was a smart cop, Barney was, the whole point of Barney was that he was inept. As was Gunther Tootie.
You mean Barney Fife, not Barney Miller.
Right, Barney Fife. Excuse me. Right, Barney Fife on the end.
Too many Barneys.
Yeah, was inept, and so was Joey Ross, Gunther Tootie on Car 54. And when you get to Barney Miller, what you see is, like Mike said, all these characters, they're definitely idiosyncratic, but the reality is they are all good cops. Even you see as the series goes on, even Levitt. There's a number of times that Levitt will be shown doing his job very well. So you, to the point that near the end you almost start siding with him against Barney. Like, really, Barney, what is the problem? Yeah. Why can't you advance him? And it's people ask me who my favorite character is, and I really mean it. I loved all the characters. I thought they were all real. I thought they were all very real people. In terms of laughter, the two characters that always made me laugh the most, and that is because their styles were similar, were Jack Sue and Steve Landesberg. I thought, even when I was a kid, I thought Dietrich was about one of the funniest characters I had ever
Love
seen.
Dietrich.
Oh yeah, he's great.
Well, Dietrich was, in a sense, a precursor to Cliff Clavin, except Cliff Clavin is dumb and a Silas, and and Dietrich actually is smart. Although there are some times when he doesn't have an answer, and he'll just cut off the scent with just a. And I think one time he even says like, "Go jump in a lake" or something.
But on Levitt, I just want to note that that is a Jewish name.
Yeah.
So once again, we have, that's actually the third character that has a Jewish identity. And for me watching it, that's the one that stood out for me as, this guy has to be Jewish. So it's just interesting the extent to which that is showing up on the program, and at the same time, the typical kind of casting that you would find on TV and in movies was basically Jewish and Italian. Those two ethnicities are interchangeable. But in this case, isn't the fellow who played Levitt, wasn't he Irish actually?
Yeah, Ron Carey.
Yeah. So again, it's just like going. Yeah.
Ron Carey was not his real name.
Oh no.
His real name was Ronald Cicenia. He was one of my guys. He's Italian.
Okay. All right. Well then, not so much.
He was he was a New Jersey Italian.
So let's talk about a couple of other minor characters, and then we'll move on to some of the themes and best episodes and whatnot. We mentioned briefly Gregory Sierra and how he was dissatisfied, I guess, mutually dissatisfaction. We mentioned Scanlon, who I love the way Murdoch would always pull up his belt, and I think that wasn't there one show where he goes, "What is this? There's no corruption here," and you can see he's so let down that they're honest cops. He can't believe it. But the two characters, I mentioned Paul Lieber and his character Dorsey, who was on for I think one season, and a few seasons before, Linda Lavin, before she got Alice, played Wentworth, which was sort of the token female character. Let me start with you, Mike. What is your take on both of those characters, and why were they eventually dropped? Obviously, Lavin got her own show.
Right. Though I loved Wentworth. I really appreciated her, and that she kind of comes off very strong at first, like too strong kind of thing. Like, oh, it's because I'm a woman, da 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 da. And she gets really upset about things. And Barney's just like, I think Barney actually is a little bit sexist, and he's proven to be wrong about that, which I really like, that he is a big enough person to realize that he has been keeping her in the station house and not sending her out as much as he should be. And then once he does, she proves that she is a really capable cop. And I also appreciated, even though, it could have been stereotypical that she, eventually becomes a love interest, but that relationship, that kind of give and take between her and Wojo, really like that. I mean, talk about fire and ice with that relationship. I dug that a lot. I kind of wish that she was still around. Yeah, she got Alice, and more power to her. She would have just been another member of the station had she stayed around the 1-2. But man, she was great. I really, really dug her, and I do like. I'm sure Otto knows a lot more about this than I do. I love how she's still mentioned in later episodes, and that's one thing I appreciate, is that you still get to see people's names up on the board, or they might get a mention every now and again, because she's been gone. With my rewatch of this, she's been gone for at least a season, but they just threw out her name in the last episode. It's like, oh, well, what about Wentworth? And they mentioned a few other cops, and it's like, oh yeah, that was the other African American from the first season that we haven't seen in 3 seasons, but they still mention these guys.
Well, they all work on the same shift, and if you work shift work, you talk about people. That guy on night shift did this, and
Right. Exactly. And yeah, and you always got the board where they're signing in and moving the piece to show that they're in, which I also appreciate. So you get to see who the other cops are that are working in that precinct.
So, Lance, let's talk about so we've set up the premise and the main characters. I mentioned, and I should say, there is a really terrific video about Barney Miller and the two gay characters that you mentioned by a fellow named Matt Baum. It's a really good a video about how the network handled that. But what was some of the major if not arcs, social issues that were first dealt with in this series, especially early on, the first couple of years, Lance?
Well, I think, policing itself, I mean, it's so much of an issue today. Um, and one of the big shifts, it would have been easy enough in a comedy to just have bad guys and, let the bad guys be, villainous or just, be greedy, whatever the motivations are, that we typically ascribe to people who are, bad or, immoral. But instead, this is kind of the prevailing movement coming out of the 60s was to explain criminality as more of a psychological issue, a mental health issue, and to focus on rehabilitation in prisons rather than punishment. And I think that the series really rode that wave in the sense that it was, that the people that were being brought in were, they were almost never just common criminals who were just doing it out of some kind of negative, evil, inclination. They were people who were troubled. I mean, maybe played for laughs that they had these issues or these foibles, but they were also treated, to this day, this is how we would want police to act, is to be sympathetic, to be, almost therapeutic and not be confrontational or just, aggressive and defensive, in the way that they treat people. So there was this very kind of generous spirit coming into it. They didn't really go that far in acknowledging the social issues behind things, that, we understand, problems like poverty, but that was an undercurrent as well. So I think that, probably more than anything else, that was a kind of powerful sensibility running through the entirety of the program, and then folded into it were the ability to deal here and there with issues like prejudice, like feminism, so talking about with Wentworth really, that was a kind of novel thing. I mean, you may remember the action show Policewoman with Angie Dickinson, that was like, this big thing. But, they dealt with it in this very, kind of, not this totally confrontational or angry kind of way. And, this was brought up before, having gay characters, there's always this give and take. So it's never like one or the other. It's incredibly progressive to just have characters of that sort, but in a way to make it palatable and safe for this mainstream audience, they also had to invoke kind of stereotypes and almost, turn it into a kind of joke, rather than get overly serious and too progressive in that depiction. But the fact that they broke that ground is very significant as well.
Well, they didn't have ever the sort of staple of real dramatic cop shows. I don't recall there ever being a serial killer or a child
Right.
molester, pedophile. There was never any high-ranking mob boss. There might have been some foot soldiers that they occasionally brought in. Was that, and I'll turn to you, Otto, was that deliberate that they didn't want to do the same kind of, oh, here's the gang leader, here's the, I mean, I guess they had a cult leader once or twice, but the choice of what kind of criminals were brought in, what was their basis for that?
Well, to kind of piggyback on things that both Mike and Lance said, you know, Danny's my interpretation of the overriding point of the whole show, and I think this is what Danny was trying to get across, because it plays throughout, and it's exactly what we're all talking about right now. His idea was to show the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
That was more important to Danny than to showing you a serial killer or some of the really ugly things that may have been happening in New York City at the time. And in fact, someone just said, I think it was Lance, just said, this is how we'd like police to act. Well, Danny literally said to his actors before they started doing the show, he's like, when you're doing your role, I want you to think how you'd want a cop to be if you had to go into a precinct and report a crime. How would you want to be treated? I mean, he literally said that to them. So Lance hit it right on the head. I mean, that was very important to Danny. And that's, I said at one point in the book, I said, I didn't want to get very political and, in a book about a TV comedy, but this is a show that, with everything that's going on in 2022 with police across America, they should really be showing these episodes to the police, because, the whole point, Barney Miller says it to his men more than once during the course of the series, where he expects them to treat everybody with respect, even the criminals.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not respect, but you can't treat them like animals. There's one line in it at some point where Wojo says, well, she's not much of a witness, Byron, she's a hooker. And Barney says to him, well, they have been known to see things before. So his whole point was always to treat these people with respect. And in terms of what kind of crimes they were showing, I think the other thing that was important to Danny, and he must have known what he was talking about, because ultimately Barney Miller is the show that more policemen cite as being the most realistic show about police ever on TV. And that is because what they showed on Barney Miller was the mundane nature of the job. They showed all the red tape and the bureaucracy. Oh my God, bureaucracy, the futility of dealing within that bureaucratic system came up constantly throughout the series, all the time. I mean, one of the things that got me interested in writing a book about it, because like I said, I was always a fan, but years ago I saw a talk show, and Dennis Farina, who was a great character actor. Well, Dennis Farina had been a Chicago police officer for 19 years before he became an actor. And he's on this talk show, and the host asked him, he says, what's the most realistic cop show ever? And he says, well, I'm going to tell you, but you're going to think I'm joking, and I'm not. He said, Barney Miller. And the guy's like, you're kidding. He says, no. He said, it shows how tedious the day-to-day work can be. He says, you watch these cop shows where every week they're shooting 20 or 30 people. He said, I was on the Chicago police force for 19 years, and I discharged my weapon twice.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really important to Danny, I think. It wasn't so much about what the crimes were that they were depicting. It was very much for him about depicting the human condition and how we treat one another.
Yeah.
Well, so many of the episodes, they resolve the crime inside of the station, which I love. Like so few people actually get moved up to the next level of the system, and maybe you get taken away to Bellevue, which, you had, mental facilities back in the day. This is pre-Reagan after all, but it was amazing just how many times Barney is able to sort things out and use that red tape against the system sometimes as well. It's like, well, you could do this and it's going to cost you so much money and take
Right.
so long, and you'll know, there was the lawyer character that was that Stuart Penkin played.
No, Alex Henteloff
Thank
played
you.
Arnold Ripken.
Right. And it's like, well, yeah, you can do that, but it's going to take all this time. And yeah, so he was able to use the red tape against the system and able to diffuse a lot of things. And that's so much. I mean, Barney is the perfect dad as well, as far as just like able to take the fighting kids and sort out who's going to get the toy. I mean, sometimes literally who's going to get the toy that.
Right. And another thing that made the show different, and I think you alluded to it earlier, Mike, was this was not your normal show. Like you're saying how often Barney would resolve it within the station. And how did he do that? Well, eventually, I don't know if you've gotten to this point yet, but there's an episode where Dietrich calls Barney out and says, I like how you do that. And Barney's like, do what? He says, I notice you always put the two litigants together so that they can talk it out themselves. And Barney's like, well, yeah, I figure that's a better idea. And he says, that way they can resolve it themselves. And Dietrich says, yeah, or beat the hell out of one another.
But the point about bureaucracy, and this is where we get into kind of the fantasy part of it, though, is that a lot of the dissatisfaction with policing in this time period was not as, I mean, there was a big problem with police brutality regarding protests and so forth. But it was also the sense that they were ineffective and overly bureaucratic. Because during the 70s and into the 80s, crime was a major problem in the United States. And there was a sense that the police just didn't care. That they would just say, oh, fill out a form and there's nothing we can do about it. We'll never find the killer or never recover the stolen goods. I don't know if if you go to the film The Terminator from 1984, the last point where people actually like the Terminator before they realize he's a monster is when he drives into the police station right after, he goes into the police station and he gets treated in this bureaucratic, unsympathetic way. And that's the and then just like drives right into it, destroying it. And that's the last point where the audience goes, yeah, right, because everyone is really ticked off about the way the police behave. And that's the opposite, again, that we see in Barney Miller, that they're working against the bureaucracy rather than being sort of functionaries of that bureaucracy. And maybe that also speaks to being in Greenwich Village. I think that's part of it too.
Well, they're also in danger of losing their jobs. Very often in those first few seasons, you get that, what was it, Ford to New York City, drop dead kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you even I think you get Ford's voice on the TV in one episode as well. Just like, yeah, you guys are going to lose all your funding. And there's several times where they are almost going to get fired or people will get moved to other precincts. And they're very afraid of losing their jobs or losing the job at the 1-2.
And who was it who came from another? Was it Dietrich came from another precinct?
Yeah.
Dietrich came from the 33rd. They closed down the 33rd precinct.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's how they close the show, is that the 12th precinct gets closed down.
Right.
Spoilers.
Yeah. One thing I did want to mention, though, it's often said, as you mentioned, Otto, that a lot of police cite it as the most realistic. But I have to say, I worked in a courtroom around the turn of the century in Minneapolis. I grew up in New York. I worked in Hennepin County, where the recent stuff with George Floyd happened. And it's also without the corruption and the blatant racism, because most of the white cops, both in New York and Minneapolis, the N-word flies regularly.
Oh.
It was mentioned earlier, the television show MASH, and they had a unique setup where that is in common with Barney Miller, in that the coming and goings of actors is easily explained, unlike a lot of other sitcoms. people get transferred into different troops or bases or whatnot. And in Barney Miller, the same thing. So it's very easy to write out a character like Fish goes and he's going to run a group home for wayward kids. Gregory Sierra, I forget what they did with him. Wentworth comes and goes. Dietrich comes. But I wanted to talk about the departure of Jack Sue via death, because I know they had a special episode for him. So they did in universe. How did they? I forget. How did they acknowledge? Was Nick killed in the line of duty, or how?
No, in fact, Hal Linden told me that when Jack Sue died, Hal suggested to Danny Arnold, he said, well, maybe we could do a thing where Nick was sick and he didn't tell anybody. He only told me. He only told Barney, and he didn't want me to tell the other guys. And then he dies. And Danny Arnold said, no, he says, I don't want to in any way exploit Jack's death. And he said, I don't know what I'm going to do yet. And then when they got to the end of the season, he just made the choice to do a rare show where they come out of character and they just talk. And apparently he told them all, prepare something and work it out among yourself, but just say what you feel about him and we'll show some clips interspersed with that. What they did the following season, because that was the end of this 5th season, what they did the following season is there is an episode where, because they don't really talk about it, but then there's an episode where they come in and the custodial staff or the superintendent, whatever, has come in and they have removed Nick's desk.
Yeah.
And Barney says something like, oh, I put that request in so long ago, I forgot about it, I'm sorry. And they talk about how it leaves a void in the room, and they insinuate that Nick is dead, but they don't ever say how he died or what happened to him or anything like that. But they do acknowledge that Nick did not go to another precinct. He went to that big precinct in the sky, basically.
So did they ever toy with the idea of bringing back Vagoda, because his spin-off tanked? But from what I've read, didn't Vagoda leave on pretty bad terms?
Yes, he and Danny. By the time Vagoda left, he and Danny were not getting along. Danny was upset because there were a couple times that I guess Vagoda had gone to other tapings, like a guest spot on a variety show or seriously a Dean Martin roast one time, and left Danny in the lurch, and Danny got really ticked off about it and said so in the press, in Variety. And you have to remember, I think I told this to Mike and his partner Chris on their show, but as we said earlier, as we alluded to earlier, no one expected this cranky old Jewish cop to be the breakout character of this show. I mean, Vagoda had been an actor for about 25 years in New York before The Godfather, and most of his relatives wouldn't have been able to pick him out of a crowd. And then he gets The Godfather, and all of a sudden everybody knows his face, and then he becomes the big hit on this show. And from everything I could gather and the people I spoke with, he kind of let it go to his head a little bit. Yeah. At one point in the second season, or maybe it was even before the second season started, he suggested to Danny Arnold that they change the name of the show to Barney and Fish. And Danny was not going to have that. And in fact, there's an episode which I think is season 2. I think it's near the end of season 2, where they introduce the Dietrich character. That episode where you go into Fish's apartment was supposed to be the spinoff episode, the pilot for the Fish spinoff, but the executives ended up not liking it. They said, we have to come up with a different idea. So he didn't leave yet. so he ends up staying another year. But Danny was trying to get rid of him by season 2, and then because he burned so many bridges, and this I heard mixed stories on this, so you don't really know what the true story is. But some people said that he did want to come back afterwards, and Danny was like, "No way, you retired, you're not coming back." And he came. He did, I believe, 2 or 3 episodes after he left the show, as like, he was retired and he came back to see how the guys were doing or whatever. And in fact, the last time he was on, Wojo asked him, how's the thing going with the kids, because he and Bernice were running like a halfway house or something for those kids, those orphan kids. And he's like, oh, the city ran out of the money, so we're not doing that anymore. So the kids are gone. And that's it. That's how they basically ended Fish's story.
Yeah.
So he might have wanted to come back, but Danny was not going to have him back after that.
Well, if the show hadn't bombed, we never would have gotten the mortal phrase, "What you talking about, Willis?"
Yeah, right. Exactly. Exactly. I think I said this to Mike before. The Fish premise was so bad. I mean, it was just bad. I said again, why wouldn't you? I always thought it would have made sense to have Fish retire and go become like a security guard at an office or a bank or another place where you can have these loony characters come in. Keep in mind, one of Danny Arnold's, he had 2 young writers who worked for him that everyone around the set used to call them Danny's Golden Boys. And that was Tony Sheehan and Reinhold Wiggy. Well, Reinhold Wiggy went and created a show called Night Court, which was basically Barney Miller, but in a night court.
A little bit more over the top than Barney Miller, though.
It was much more slapstick and much more.
And I think it's a great show. It's a balls to the wall comedy, where this is more reserved comedy. But as to your point, I wanted to bring up, as to your point about the Fish premise, you said you're a New Yorker as well?
I'm a New Yorker, but I'm not a New Yorker. Okay. I live in Rochester, New York.
Okay, because if I don't know if you've been there all your life, but in the 1970s, there was a big thing called CETA, C-E-T-A, which was a Comprehensive Employment Training Act, in which young children or teenagers were going around, because my mom worked at a senior center, and I would be there helping out, and I'd meet these kids. So there were a lot of these kinds of things where the city and the state of New York were actively trying to help young people from underprivileged circumstances. So it was a realistic premise. A lot of them were a lot of. So I mean, I don't think it might have been not executed well, but I don't think the premise was necessarily terrible.
No. I don't mean the premise was unrealistic. I just meant that it didn't really make sense for Fish, in my opinion, because it was a one joke premise, which is introduced in Barney, and that is that he doesn't like kids.
Right.
So it seemed to me like more of a 60s sitcom premise. It was this one joke that kind of had to carry the series along,
Yeah. I mean, Fish himself was he was kind of 2 jokes. He was his bowels, and it was how much he disliked Bernice. And after a while, it was just like, okay, enough with the wife jokes, especially because Bernice was a very nice person. So it's like, quit making fun of her.
Well, it was the Henny Youngman era.
Yeah.
In the book, Mike, you will appreciate somewhere in there, I don't know where it is, but I give you the list of all of Fish's ailments that he talked about through the years.
Didn't he have like diverticulitis once or something?
He had everything.
Which is very Jewish, by the way. It's hypochondria.
So let's talk about the end of the show, both in universe and out. Is it true Danny Arnold wanted the show? He's the one that ended it. It wasn't ABC.
He did, yes. In fact, what happened was at the end of season 5, Danny had to go and have open heart surgery. In those first 5 seasons, he basically gave up his life for this show. People said that there were nights that he just slept in the office. And he really, some people, a lot of people actually thought that he really hurt his own health by how hard he worked on that show. So at the end of season 5, like I said, Tony Sheehan and Reinhold Wigge were his two lieutenants, for lack of a better word. And he called Sheehan in and he says, I'm not going to be here next year. He's like, the doctor, I'm having open heart surgery, and the doctor told me I have to step away for a while. Can you handle it? And Tony Sheehan said to him, sure, Danny, Riney and I can handle it, no problem. And he's like, no. He's like, Riney just signed a deal with Warner's, so he's leaving as well.
Mm.
So at the end of season 5, both Reinhold Wigge and Danny Arnold left, and it was left to Tony Sheehan. And he eventually hires these two guys named Frank Dungan and Jeff Stein. And basically, the three of them were really the heart and soul of the writing staff for season 6 and 7. After season 7, Tony had enough because it was high pressure. And by the way, Tony Sheehan, it's amazing to me, but he told me Barney Miller was his first job out of college. So he was a kid when he started on it. And so he wanted to walk away after season 7. And apparently he made the mistake of saying, Danny said something to the cast and crew with me there in front of all of them, that we were going to finish it at the end of season 7. He's like, they wanted to keep going because they're making money and stuff like that. And what happened was Ted Flicker, you remember Ted Flicker, the supposed co-creator, had already, through the first 7 years of the show, been constantly suing Danny Arnold over profits. And they were and Danny was countersuing him and all these things. So they were in constant litigation, Flicker and Arnold. So at the end of season 7, Danny was going to hang up the cleats, and Flicker went to court and said he's doing this to lessen my residuals so that there's less profits for me to get. So Danny finally decided he would do one more season, then he would take over after Tony left, and he would keep Dungan and Stein on. And then actually what happened when they do the final trilogy in season 8, he actually asked Tony Sheehan to come back and help them write it. So Sheehan, Dungan, Stein, and Danny wrote that final trilogy that finishes up the program. But yeah, he took it off the air after 8 seasons. And by the way, Alan Alda could have learned something from him, because like you say, MASH could easily explain people coming and going. It was harder to explain them aging 12 years in front of our eyes for a 2-year police action. So
right.
And also too, MASH, as great a show as it was, probably has, I would say, the lowest success rate of consistently good episodes. I mean, there are some abysmal episodes in the first few years when they were still doing the Asian stereotypes and stuff, and then the last few years when it got a little bit self-indulgent. So shows like The Odd Couple, which was only 5 years and they ended it. Bob Newhart, which went only 6 years. Mary Tyler Moore, 7 years. They didn't jump the shark, as the old saying goes.
Exactly. And just to speak to something Lance said near the beginning, I didn't mean to leave Mary Tyler Moore out when I mentioned All in the Family and MASH. The reason I excluded it is because Mary was another show, as far as I was concerned, like Barney, that remained funny throughout its 7-year run.
Yeah.
I mean, Mary Tyler Moore's show was always brilliantly funny. Always.
So let's talk about the afterlife of the show, both critically and also, it was mentioned earlier that it's not like The Odd Couple. In the 1980s, The Odd Couple was everywhere. Gilligan's Island and I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners have run for 60, 70 years. But Barney Miller, I mean, yes, I guess it's been on assorted, substations and cable stations. Is it still, do you think, an underrated show that's often forgotten when people talk about the greatest sitcoms? Let me start with you, Mike.
Well, it's not like we're tearing up the charts with our Barney Miller podcast, and it's not like there were other Barney Miller podcasts before ours. You know, we're also doing one on Columbo, and we're like, you know, the tagline is yet another Columbo podcast because there are so darn many. There's not a lot of Barney Miller podcasts. I think there's a couple episodes here and there of people just kind of like this, where it's like, okay, we're going to talk about Barney Miller, but it's not as popular as I think it could be. And I think there's still some name recognition, but I, you talk to my 20, 30-year-old coworkers, they're going to have no idea who Barney Miller is, unfortunately.
Is it because none of the actors ever became bigger, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm not sure if that's the reason or if it was so much because I can't even say that it was a product of the time because it is very timeless. I don't find myself having to explain all of the jokes. You know, I've got Anna's mentioned my younger co-host on there, Chris Stashew. Occasionally I'll be like, okay, here's a little bit of color commentary, what was happening at the time, but I don't have to do that all the time. So it's not like it's this time capsule that people couldn't understand today. It is like your Andy Griffiths or your Car 54s where these jokes do transcend time. So I'm not sure if it's that, you know, people are like, oh, what else did Hal Linden do? But that's a very good point.
Dan, I think you're right, Dan. I think that is one of the reasons because this was a true ensemble show, but like you say, none of these people became huge major, huge major stars. I mean, Hal Linden won a Tony Award right before he did Barney Miller for The Rothschild, so he was very big. He was a big Broadway star. But Max Gale, this was really his first starring role. Ron Glass had done guest spots, but this was his first starring role. Gregory Sierra had been on Sanford, like you mentioned, but again, he didn't do much after this. Jack Sue obviously died in the middle of this show. The one who was the most well known is, as you said, I think earlier, because he was such a great and ubiquitous character actor, was James Gregory. But he was always that. He was always a character actor, so he wasn't a star.
And oftentimes he was wearing makeup on assorted 1960s sci-fi. Right? He was the Planet of the Apes. You know,
yeah,
right. Exactly. So it wasn't like he was a household name like Mary Tyler Moore or Alan Alda, you know, stuff like that. And the other thing is, and this is going to, we're near the end, so I can break out my dark, cynical side. It's really intelligent.
Yeah.
It's really intelligent. Gilligan's Island is really dumb. I mean, no offense to anyone who likes it, because, like I said, there's silly shows that I like too, but it's Gilligan's Island is a dumb show.
yeah.
You know, so this show was always very smart. I actually, what surprised me the most when I went and watched the show over again when I was doing the book, this show, it is dated in some ways. Like Mike mentioned, the Ford to New York City Drop Dead episode, and they talk about the layoffs in New York City and all the financial troubles that were happening with the city at the time and all those things. In that way, it is dated. But as he also said, sadly, all of the issues they covered are still social issues today.
Yeah.
And some of them might make some of the younger people more uncomfortable. I mean, like my daughter, she comes at these shows as what she is, a 28-year-old woman, so that, you know, we grew up with All in the Family and the Jeffersons and Sanford and Son and, you know, all these shows where, I mean, I know for a fact in every one of those shows that I just mentioned, the N word was uttered in every one of those shows. Now, it doesn't matter the context. If you use that word in a show today, my daughter would her mind would explode. Okay, so it's a different. I do think it's still underrated, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, because I do think, for whatever reason, I think it's underrated. I think it should be better known than it is.
Well, let me just.
It's funny that you mentioned.
Oh, go ahead, Lance.
It's funny. It's funny that you mentioned about the N word, because we last month we had a session with the Institute of General Semantics with John McWhorter, who wrote a book called 9 Nasty Words, and one of his arguments is that the N word has replaced the F word as the kind of the worst words that you can utter. But I did want to say
it's
that
interesting too that the N word was never one of the 7 words that Carlin had on his list.
Right.
True.
Yeah. But I did want to say, I mean, I do agree that there is no one came out of it as a breakout star. Again, Abe Vigoda came into it in a way sort of like that. But when you mentioned Night Court, I was thinking the show that I was thinking of was Taxi. And how you could compare the two and look at all the folks who came out of Taxi, who were went on to become big stars, and the contrast is very marked. I think the thing I would say about Barney Miller is its subtlety. When you talk about its intelligence, it's a subtle intelligence that and it's not groundbreaking in that sense. That is, again, going back, Mary Tyler Moore, MASH, All in the Family, they broke new ground. Barney Miller followed in their footsteps. It did some really great stuff, but it didn't really change the game for anybody. We can see it as leading to some of these other programs that push the boundaries even further. But I think in some ways you could arguably say it's a show whose time has come, again, because of George Floyd and because of all of the concern about police work and nowadays. Maybe this is a show that someone needs to pick up on, beyond our session here or your podcast, Mike, or Otto's book, but someone needs to pick up on and kind of bring it to the fore. And dare I say it, I shudder to say this, even a reboot, might be in order at this moment in time.
Yeah, but then they probably would have like
ruin it.
A trans woman as Barney, or something, and not that you can't have trans people as comedic characters, but it would probably be so over the other side of trying to please every group, whereas this one wasn't. You did anticipate my question that I was going to end with you, Lance, on, and I want to ask you all to just give a little summary of why you think it's great. But I did want to stand up, though, for Gilligan's Island for this reason, because if I think of all the high concept shows, the only high concept sitcom from the 60s that I think is in a league with Gilligan's Island would be Get Smart, but it isn't as timeless. And I think Gilligan's Island, the reason it is, along with I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners, the most successful show is it is timeless. You could be 500 years ago, 500 years from now on a desert island or on some asteroid or something, and the same premise. Gilligan's always going to fuck up. That they're always never going to kill him so that they can get off the island. And I think it's the closest thing to an American Beckett. But let me just go.
Dan, I have to say, I never thought of the fact that if they had just killed him, they could have gotten off that island.
Yeah. Well, you remember the episode where the island's sinking, but it's just Gilligan moving the professor's stick out a little further or whatnot. But so let me start with you, Otto. Then, for anyone who hasn't seen Barney Miller, why is it a great show, and why should they watch it?
For all the things we've talked about. I mean, for me, the greatest aspect is the fact that it is about the human condition. It is about laughing at ourselves You know, Danny's main idea of the comedy for this show was paranoids with proof. And there are numerous episodes where someone comes in. My favorite one is the guy who has come in and they've arrested him because he was in the department store and he found the room where the Muzak was originating, and he smashed the Muzak machine because it was driving him crazy. And they bring him in and they think he's just another crackpot, right? And when they put him in, he's like, no, no, no. He's like, I have proof. And he pulls an article out of his jacket, a newspaper article, and it tells you in the article that these stores are actually putting subliminal messages in the Muzak, which, by the way, on the DVD release now, you see that they bleeped out Muzak because it was a brand name. But that was a big thing. It happens in more than one episode. There's another one with Don Calfa where he comes in because he says he rode the New York City subways all his life, and he pulls out an article where they show that the government had been testing germs in the subway, and that he felt he was sick because the government was doing this. So Danny, that was a real linchpin to the show, was paranoids with proof. Again, something that makes it kind of really relevant today, except most of our conspiracy theorists today are really crackpots. Yeah. But this is, it's the thing that I love most about it is the humanity of all the characters, and the fact that in the end, the point sort of is we're all in this together. We're all kind of stuck in this crazy world together.
Lance, same question. Why is Barney Miller great, and why should someone watch it?
Well, I really like Otto's point, about the human condition. I would say, with that it just depicts fundamental decency, that, and that so much of the comedy that we have today kind of feature characters who are just kind of crappy people, like Curb Your Enthusiasm, and that becomes part of the joke, and part of the identification is to connect to that part of all of us that we sort of cringe at, or the experiences that we cringe at. But this is just that people can get along, and people can be good to one another, and be sensitive without being super woke about it, to just be decent to one another. And that's the way the world should be, and things would be a lot better in that way. With that, I think, is the point that it was really well written and intelligent, and you can do that without hitting you over the head with its sort of intellectuality, just kind of, make you feel like this is real. These are, real people. These are people that you can really like and feel good about.
And before I finish up with Mike, I will link to the academic page for Lance. I will link to the book on Amazon for Otto, and also your podcast page, Mike. Mike, same question. If you're on Barney Miller, why is it great, and why should we watch it?
If anybody said that it's simply funny. It is really solidly funny. Every single episode, I find myself laughing. You mentioned the hash episode. I mean, you could be dropped into that, not really knowing who these characters are. You can get a sketch of them, such a thumbnail within the first 5 seconds of watching the show, and find that episode as funny as anybody else. It is so good. And so much of that too is the chemistry between those characters, and they really did a great job of never losing that chemistry. Even though they changed up who was in that station house, having those constants of Barney and Wojo and Harris, I mean, that core group and having all those other characters who are coming in and out, they managed to keep that magic, which is really remarkable that they were able to do that and not lose the thread when they're losing characters and gaining characters. I mean, you could say, oh, well, Nick was dry and Dietrich was dry, but they never canceled each other out. They were perfect. They were a great balance. And then even when you lose Nick, you've still got Dietrich. I mean, everybody just brought their game to this, and the writing top notch. You know, that's where so much of the comedy came from. So just, yeah, solidly funny day in, day out, every single episode. Even when they have a poignant episode and poignant moment, you still get a really good blast of comedy in there.
And I just want to add, usually I don't, but I just want to add, the show is Barney Miller, and I have to say, Hal Linden is greatly underrated, not only as a stand-up comedian, because he started out, I think, as a big band singer, and here he is, the anchor, basically, of this comedy with all these other characters that are so well written, and he plays off of them so well, and he's you can't imagine Barney Miller or Linden ever saying, well, I need to have that line or something. It seems so natural. And in all the years since, 40 years now, it's like the only thing I can remember Hal Linden being in was in one of the penultimate episodes of a show called Nowhere Man, a great show on Fox. Well, no, was it Fox or CW back in the mid 90s, a paranoid prisoner like show. But I mean, I just think Hal Linden is a very underrated actor.
Well, ironically, you said you can't imagine him wanting, a line.
Oh, don't spoil it. Don't spoil it.
No. I'm not going to spoil it. It's just he told me that in the Hash episode that we've talked about, he went to Danny and he said, Danny, everybody's got this great aria, this great scene that they can do with this, except me. And Danny says, yeah, he says, we got to have someone to play them, that they can play off of. If we have to have someone in the precinct who's sober, or else they're not that funny if you're all like that. And Hal said to me, he says, I sort of knew it, but at the same time, in that episode was when I first finally accepted that that's what my role was to be the straight man and to be the anchor. And he says, then I felt much better about it. But I agree with you. He was fabulous, and he like the show being underrated. He's very underrated within the show because he doesn't have all those huge laugh lines.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. It was a great show. Oh, go ahead.
Just that he was a great actor and of course a Broadway actor. But
when you say did he recently die? I thought
I'm sorry, I meant on the show, but he also was very poignant, and the thing that really sticks out for me was when he was separated from his wife, and that was a point where what's the opposite of jumping the shark? It's like, for me, that kind of blew me away as a young person watching it, just that they got so serious and that he so strongly conveyed that sense of emotion without really, any kind of theatrics, but it just came across that terrible sadness of his marriage falling apart, and that to me just encapsulates what he was as an actor.
Yeah, it was very real.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again. It was a great show, and I really thank you for it.
Well, thank you, Dan. This was a lot of fun.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate it.